We landed at Charlotte Douglas at 6:47 in the evening after 14 days in Portugal. 14 days of genuinely the most restorative vacation my husband and I had taken in 8 years of marriage. And I turned my phone off airplane mode somewhere over the Atlantic and watched the notifications load. And among the texts from friends and the work emails and the pharmacy reminder about a prescription refill, there was a message from our next door neighbor Linda, sent 4 days earlier, that read, "Hey, just wanted to check. Did you know there are people living in your house? Lights on every night, car in the driveway. Didn't want to call the police without checking with you first." I read that message sitting in seat 24C at 35,000 feet, and I showed it to my husband James without saying anything. Just handed him my phone and watched his face go through the same sequence mine had just gone through. Confusion. Then a slow, specific recognition that landed somewhere in the vicinity of dread. He said one word. Mom. His parents, Gerald and Susan Hartley, had a copy of our house key. They had been given it 2 years earlier during a medical situation of Gerald's that had required us to ask them to check on the house while we were at the hospital. We had never asked for it back. There had never seemed to be a reason to. There was a reason now. James called his mother from seat 24C somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, and she answered on the second ring and said, with the particular warm brightness of someone who has decided in advance that the conversation they are about to have is going to be framed as good news. "James, how is Portugal?" "We've been keeping the house so nice. We've actually made some changes you're both going to love." James looked at me across the narrow aisle between our seats. I looked back at him. "What changes, Mom?" he said. "Before I tell you what we found when we pulled into our driveway at 8:15 that evening, and what Gerald and Susan had apparently decided across 14 days of unsupervised access to our home constituted reasonable behavior. Tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it?" I genuinely read every comment, and knowing this community exists has meant more to me than I know how to properly say. And I want to be upfront before we go further. This is a work of fiction, written for entertainment. The names, the people, the events. None of it is real, and any resemblance to anyone living is entirely coincidental. My name is Rachel Hartley. I'm 31 years old, and for 8 years I've been married to a man named James. An architect, meticulous in the specific way of someone whose profession requires holding an enormous amount of spatial and structural information in mind simultaneously, and who applies that same organizational precision to his personal life, which is, in practice, both one of his most genuinely appealing qualities, and occasionally, mildly, exhausting to live with. James's parents, Gerald and Susan, were 64 and 62, respectively. Retired, energetic, deeply invested in their son's life in the specific, well-intentioned, occasionally overwhelming way of parents who have more time and fewer natural limits on their involvement than is always comfortable for the people being involved with. I want to be fair to Gerald and Susan, because fairness matters here, and because the story I am about to tell is complicated by the fact that what they did was not motivated by malice. It was motivated by something considerably more difficult to argue with: genuine love, expressed in a way that had absolutely no regard for the concept of boundaries, or for the legal and emotional distinction between being given a key for emergencies and being given permanent access to someone else's home. They were not bad people. They were people who had decided, somewhere across 8 years of our marriage, that James's home was an extension of their family space rather than a separate, sovereign household, and that our 2-week absence represented an opportunity to express that belief in the most concrete possible terms. Gerald and Susan had moved into our house on the 3rd day of our vacation. This was not, they would explain later, an impulsive decision. They had discussed it between themselves before we left, apparently for some time. Their own condominium, 20 minutes away, had an HVAC repair scheduled for the exact 2 weeks we were in Portugal, and rather than stay in a hotel or arrange alternative accommodation, they had decided that our house was the logical solution, since we weren't using it and they had a key. They had not told us this. When I asked Susan, later, why they hadn't mentioned it, she said, with complete apparent sincerity, without any awareness that what she was saying was extraordinary. "We didn't want you to worry about anything while you were on vacation. We knew you'd say yes." The assumption that we would say yes. The complete absence, in their minds, of the question itself. That single detail told me, more clearly than anything else in the entire situation, exactly how they understood the relationship, and how differently James and I understood it. What they had done across those 11 days inside our home was, depending on how you chose to look at it, either incredibly helpful or an almost comprehensive violation of every boundary a home represents. The answer, I discovered at 8:23 in the evening when we walked through our front door, was definitely the second one, presented in the completely sincere belief that it was the first. The changes Susan had mentioned on the phone were, in scope and ambition, genuinely extraordinary. The living room furniture had been rearranged. Not slightly, not in a way that reflected a practical adjustment for their temporary use, but comprehensively, according to a spatial logic that was entirely Susan's, and that bore no relationship to the arrangement James and I had spent nearly 2 years settling into after our last renovation. The kitchen pantry had been reorganized. Everything I had put where I put it. The system I had developed over 3 years of cooking in that kitchen, the one that made sense to me and that I could navigate without thinking, had been replaced with a different organizational structure entirely, one that grouped items by Susan's categories rather than mine. Our guest bedroom had been repainted, not touched up, repainted, in a color I had not chosen and had not been consulted about, applied over a color I had selected 3 years earlier with considerable thought, using paint that was stacked neatly in the corner of the room with the receipt still attached. The backyard had been landscaped. This was the detail I found most difficult to stand in front of, because it was the most irreversible. 3 ornamental grasses I had planted 4 years ago, removed, replaced with a rose variety Susan apparently preferred, planted with the permanent confidence of someone who expects to be gardening in this yard for a long time. And in James's study. His personal workspace, the room where he kept his architectural files and his drafting materials, and the organized chaos of a working professional's private space. His filing system had been tidied, which meant that 14 months of a specific organizational logic had been replaced with something that looked considerably neater and was, in practice, essentially unusable, until he could reconstruct what had gone where. Gerald and Susan were sitting in our rearranged living room when we arrived, drinking tea from our mugs, relaxed, comfortable. And Susan looked up with the warm expectation of someone waiting to be thanked. James and I stood in the doorway of our own living room for a moment that lasted approximately 6 seconds and felt considerably longer. Then James said, very quietly, "Mom, Dad, I need you to walk me through exactly what has happened in this house over the past 11 days." What followed was a 2-hour conversation that I will describe as the most instructive of our 8-year marriage. Not because of anything either Gerald or Susan said, but because of what I observed in James during it. I watched him process, in real time, the gap between the parents he had always understood himself to have and the parents who were sitting in his rearranged living room, explaining with complete earnestness that the ornamental grasses had always seemed like the wrong choice for that space. Gerald and Susan did not understand, throughout that conversation, that they had done anything that required an apology rather than an explanation. Susan described the paint color in the guest room with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a home improvement discovery. Gerald described the pantry reorganization as a gift. Really. You'll thank us once you get used to it. James was, throughout, entirely controlled. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He did not raise his voice once. When Gerald and Susan had finished, when they had described, thoroughly and without apparent awareness of how it was landing, every change they had made, James said, calmly and finally, "I need you to go home now. I'll call you in a few days." Susan looked genuinely shocked, as if she had been told something she hadn't prepared for. "James, we were helping." "I know you were," James said. "Please go home." They went. The conversation James and I had after they left was one of the most important of our marriage. Not because it was dramatic. We were too tired for drama by then. But because it was honest in a way that some conversations about in-laws never quite managed to be. James told me that he had spent 8 years accommodating his parents' version of involvement because he had told himself the boundary violations were small, individual, and manageable in isolation. That this had been the pattern. Small things, one at a time, each one individually excusable. And that the sum of them had become something he could no longer address incrementally. "They painted our guest room," he said, which was not really about the paint. "Yes," I said, which was not really about the paint either. We talked for 2 hours. We decided on 3 things: concrete, specific, stated clearly. Gerald and Susan would return the key, which James would retrieve personally. Any future visits to our home would be scheduled in advance and agreed to by both of us explicitly and without assumption. And the ornamental grasses, planted by Susan with the certainty of someone making a permanent decision in a space they considered theirs, would be replaced. We would find the same variety or something close and replant them ourselves because the backyard was ours and we had the right to decide what grew in it. James called his parents the following morning. The conversation was difficult. Susan cried. Gerald was defensive. There was a period of approximately 3 weeks during which the relationship was strained in the particular uncomfortable way of a family dynamic being renegotiated after a long period of accumulated accommodation. But the key came back. The visits are scheduled now. Gerald and Susan have been, in the months since that conversation, more careful. Not transformed, not perfect, but more careful. In the way of people who have had it made clear, for the first time with real consequences attached, that a line exists and that they crossed it. The guest room is its original color again. James did it himself, over 2 weekends, methodically. 4 coats, because that was what it took. And he did it himself rather than hiring someone because he wanted to, he said, which I understood completely. The ornamental grasses are back. We found the same variety at a nursery 40 minutes away and planted them on a Saturday in October, the 2 of us in the backyard together, in the particular good silence of people doing something that doesn't require words. The pantry is back in my system, which takes some learning, but which, I maintain, is entirely logical. James's filing system in the study took 3 weeks to reconstruct. 3 weeks of Sunday afternoons, going through folders one at a time, rebuilding something that had existed in his head and been expressed on paper in a way that only he fully understood. He did not complain about it once. He simply rebuilt it, the way you rebuild things when rebuilding is what the situation requires. I think often about Linda, our neighbor, who had seen the lights on and the car in the driveway for 4 days and had texted rather than called the police, giving us the chance to handle it ourselves rather than arriving home to a situation that had already been taken out of our hands. "I didn't want to overreact," Linda told me when I thanked her. But something didn't feel right, so I said something. Something didn't feel right, so she said something. That is, in the end, almost always the right call. About the lights in a driveway. About the ornamental grasses that aren't the ones you planted. About the filing system that someone else has rearranged. About any of the small, specific, easy to dismiss things that accumulate quietly into something larger than any individual one of them suggests. Pay attention to what doesn't feel right. And then say something. Do you think we handled it correctly by not taking legal action? Or should unauthorized occupation of someone's home, even by family, carry formal consequences? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the Family Ledger for a brand new story every single day. Hit that bell. You do not want to miss what is coming next.